Hi, and welcome to the Teams by Intent podcast, where we explore how forward-thinking leaders are redefining workforce strategy by putting skills at the center of hiring, development, and long-term team design. The Teams by Intent podcast is brought to you by Breault Placement, a workforce partner that connects leading organizations with the talent their competitors miss. I'm James Krause, your host. Welcome, and thanks for listening. Hi, and welcome to the Teams by Intent podcast. My name is James Krause for Breault Placement, and joining me today is Katie Breault, who is the Chief Delivery Officer at Breault Placement. Hi, Katie.
Hi, James. Nice to see you.
Why don't you just tell us a little bit about what you do as Chief Delivery Officer?
So here at Breault Placement, my role is to oversee our sales, client delivery, and recruiting teams. So the way to think about it is I am overseeing the entities that are connecting the employers who are looking to build great teams with the talent who makes up those teams.
Great. And speaking of great teams, what we're here to talk about today is the Great Teams Playbook, which you and I were part of putting together in a formatted discussion with some leaders at a roundtable at the ProcureCon Contingent Staffing 2026. Tell us a little bit about how this came together.
Sure. So we knew that we had the opportunity to bring together leaders at this event that we attend every year, ProcureCon Contingent Staffing. And while we were brainstorming, how can we maximize this opportunity to get the great minds who are building these teams across the country and draw some insights? We thought, let's invite them to lunch, have some great conversations about what's working for them and what isn't, and then compile those insights and the themes that we were seeing into a playbook that we could share more broadly with our many partners.
I wanted to kind of touch on some of the overall themes and kind of get past some of the stuff about, building culture and things like that, and really kind of get down to how these workforce leaders are actually finding and keeping talent. One of the things that really came up was that some of the best candidates are often being screened out. And I'll just read a quote here directly from the discussion. We keep hiring for the person who already did the job somewhere else instead of the person who could do that job here.
We actually had an incredible conversation at my lunch table around this concept. The idea was that many of the folks at our table were used to hiring for the same things. And what they were learning when they weren't seeing the retention they were looking for, or somebody wasn't the right fit, was that maybe they were looking at the wrong talent pool. And so they were talking about how expanding the talent pool beyond what they were used to looking for to include some non-traditional talent really gave them the opportunity to hire for potential instead of somebody who did the job somewhere else. So specifically, this one person at our table said they kept hiring for this sales position with folks at a competitor who were doing the job well there. Well, what they learned was by just looking at the resume and where they went to school, that then putting them into their company didn't necessarily mean that the results translated, because they didn't necessarily have the adaptability to do things their way. They didn't necessarily have the skills that they were looking for with the nuances of their role. And so they decided to focus instead on what does it look to hire somebody for potential to be successful in their particular environment. Looking for things like adaptability and willingness to learn and ability to learn and coachability are some of the key themes that came up with what they were looking for now instead of those traditional criteria.
And there's another bullet point here that cites that managers are requiring a 4 out of 5 criteria and missing strong talent in the gap. What I got a sense from these discussions were that the people that we were talking to really kind of saw this problem, but they're dealing with their coworkers, the managers, maybe the department leaders, maybe it's the hiring manager, who they're really kind of requiring these different criteria.
Absolutely. They were really focused on how they're working with hiring managers and building a sense of trust to really dive deep into what are those criteria that might have worked for you 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and looking at the job description, really diving deep into the skills that are needed to do the job, and removing any barriers that might be filtering out candidates who actually would be the right fit. It requires a lot of trust and transparency. And so that's what they were talking about building within their own organizations.
And they also talked about nonlinear talent, which I thought was a really important phrase to emerge from this. We talk a lot about non-traditional talent, really kind of people who are coming through the pipeline maybe without a college degree. But this idea of nonlinear talent is a little bit more expansive, right?
Yep. Yes. And so when our table was talking about nonlinear talent, they were thinking about talent who hadn't necessarily gone through a traditional pathway. So meaning maybe it had been working for years to hire folks who were right out of college or who had experience at this particular company or within this particular industry and to follow a formula that seemed to be working for a while. That isn't working so much anymore. And so they're kind of starting from scratch and thinking about how can we broaden that talent pipeline to hire nonlinear talent, meaning folks who didn't necessarily follow exactly what you were supposed to do at certain stages, and instead focus on what are the skills that they bring that would make them successful in this role. One great example was a member at our table was used to filtering out based on degree just to narrow the talent pool, make it a little bit easier to identify a smaller pool of candidates. But instead, she removed that degree requirement, opened it up, and then filtered instead for what exactly are the skills needed and found a much greater fit for her hiring manager she was working with.
And that's kind of interesting because I think that need to just narrow down the pile of resumes that are coming toward them really speaks to kind of the how industrial things have gotten in terms of it's so much easier to post jobs. It's so much easier to apply for jobs. It's so much easier to screen for jobs. And you and I have talked about that. I mean, AI is kind of, it's creating more resumes. It's creating more resumes tailored to jobs, but it's also creating a way to screen out those resumes. And, in some ways, it's like we just need to kind of get past this madness and get down to like, hey, what's a strategy that's actually going to work?
That was the common theme across all of the tables that what we've been doing isn't working anymore. And
Mm.
so that same problem that decades ago resulted in degree requirements for roles that didn't necessarily require a degree, that problem is now exacerbated by exactly what you mentioned, the AI resumes. Whether or not resumes are actually reflecting what a candidate's abilities are versus being tailored by AI to a job description. Trained talent for a long time now to make sure you're tailoring your resume to the job description. But when humans are doing it and drawing back on their actual experience and skills, it's a lot different than what we're now able to see with AI doing this to pump out hundreds, if not thousands, of resumes for a single job.
And I want to kind of, leapfrog into, we've talked about like resumes and screening and kind of the criteria. Once you get somebody in the room, you have an interview. Maybe it's virtual, maybe it's in person. But one of the things that came up from this is that, interviews are a weak signal. And, some of the quotes, I'll read one here. She got hired because of who showed up at lunch, not who showed up in the interview room. And there's really this idea that some people are really good at interviews and some people aren't good at interviews. I think one of the quotes said that, some people are great at interviewing and terrible at the job. Others are great at the job and terrible at interviewing. That idea that sort of, interviews, which are sort of this cornerstone of finding talent, isn't the best indicator in the world of how somebody's going to be good at a job.
I heard a couple of great stories around this. It was one of my favorite topics. The first one was how early in one of our participants' careers, they received some great advice. And that was that oftentimes folks are hired because they're the kind of person that you want to go out and grab a drink with. But the advice that she received was hire the person who you don't hire for that reason. Hire the person you're going to want to take out for a drink because of how well they're performing in the job. And so that was one of my favorite takeaways that this person has carried with them throughout their career. But separately, another person at our table was talking about the analogy with dating. Right? A really good interviewer is not so different from somebody who's really good at dating. And so
Mhm.
for those first few dates, like sure, they're going to have their best version of themselves. You might hear some stories that are maybe a little bit flexed and not necessarily indicative of if you want to spend the rest of your life with this person. So, who would accept a marriage proposal after a couple of dates? Similarly, why would you think that a couple of interviews are going to tell you everything you need to know about how somebody will perform on the job?
Right, right. I thought one of the surprising things too from that section was veterans that came up, and it kind of gets to the nonlinear talent that we were talking about before. And they were cited as an example of highly capable individuals who are really like struggling to translate their experience into a traditional interview language. And the quote that comes from that is like they've done incredible things, but they've never had to explain it in an interview. And I thought that was interesting that I mean, somebody who's coming out of military service may be highly qualified for what they do, but they just don't know how to talk about it.
So, one person at our table was talking about how they are specifically partnering with organizations serving veterans looking to enter the workforce because, to your point, those skills are incredibly transferable to so many different roles, but communicating them might not be as intuitive as one might think. So, working with those organizations to help veterans translate their skills into the roles that they were hiring for has been a huge success for her.
So let's kind of leap ahead. We talked about kind of, screening for candidates. We talked about the interview process, actually kind of coming on the job. One of the things that came up was really the first 90 days, and that really kind of defines success. And a quote that I'll cite here is, "I wanted you to make the mistakes so that you can learn how to recover from them." And this idea that we need to hire the perfect candidate, and if they're not performing well, then we need to kind of talk about it. But it's like really that first 90 days is hugely important. And that's just as much a management issue as anything else.
Now, this conversation was actually very tied into exactly what we were talking about with interviews, right? So, how you are able to identify in a couple of conversations somebody's ability to be successful in an interview is a lot less reliable than giving somebody a chance over the course of 90 days. And to your point, seeing what happens when they make those mistakes. Do they take accountability? Are they able to pivot and do they not make them again? Those aren't qualities that you're able to necessarily see and experience in an interview. Because if I were being interviewed and somebody asked me, if I make a mistake, do I take accountability? Like, of course I do. But seeing it in practice over those first 90 days is absolutely critical.
It also made me think a lot about some of the things that we've talked about with apprenticeships, with even like contingent programs where, somebody's able to work in an environment where they're learning, where the expectations are that they're not going to be perfect, that this is a learning experience. Do you think that that kind of fits into this discussion about, that first 90 days?
Absolutely. And it was so interesting talking about this whole concept of apprenticeships because that was one of the topics that were discussed. Because now everyone feels like they're in some way, shape, or form in an apprenticeship. Everybody is learning on the job with all of the changes that are happening in the workforce. So, apprenticeship is a very natural solution to bring talent with the skills that companies are looking for through a structured program with the support of a training entity because we're all training right now, we're all upskilling. And so, why not do it very intentionally? Why not build
Hmm.
a great team by intent?
Right, right, right. Well, yeah, and also like, what does the pipeline look like in terms of how you're bringing talent in, and something like an apprenticeship, something like even a contingent program. That's a way to build up that pipeline,
Mhm.
and really kind of, it's not really about testing somebody out, but it's really about, hey, is this person the right fit? Do they have the right skills? All those things that aren't going to come across in an interview can really come across when they're actually on the job, learning that job. And, what you end up with is a stronger pipeline in the end, period, which is the goal everyone should have.
And it's a strategy that now many companies, and especially the leaders in that room, we're talking about leveraging not just for early career roles, but for early and mid career roles. Like, how do you find that talent and then really give them the runway to show what they can do?
And I think, turnover came up in one of the conversations too. And it kind of came under the banner of, culture is what you tolerate. And I think the quote here that came up under that was, a trail of turnover usually leads back to one person no one wanted to deal with. When it comes to some of the talent challenges that these workforce leaders are facing, it's not just about the supply of talent. It's also about how that talent's being managed. And I thought that that was just interesting that they cited this in terms of, really looking toward management as being just as much part of that success as anything else.
And going back to that concept of here we had these contingent workforce leaders all in one room. So they're the ones who are helping hiring managers build these teams. That was another theme that surfaced around that concept of transparency and having those honest conversations with hiring managers. Because if you have one manager overseeing a team and there's just constant turnover, you have another manager overseeing a similar team and there isn't. And to your point, it all really goes back to that person. One of the themes and one of the great insights that I heard at my table was around how the great managers are the ones who are building skill sets and really intentionally being inclusive in their hiring because they want those different perspectives and they want disagreement because that means that they're able to really see the whole picture and get all those different perspectives in the room because nobody wants to hire all the same people. You want to make sure that you have a team that can help you perform.
I think that and this came up at my table, and I thought that this was interesting. Really looking toward the future, and really kind of like the present, a trend that's happening now is that more and more companies are going toward an outsourced model. So a statement of work model. And one of the quotes that kind of sum this up is, we're not managing people anymore, we're managing problems, and usually short term ones. And I thought this was like really interesting because this group of people, have really kind of developed a whole career around building pipelines of talent, building teams. And now they're really being told, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to outsource it because that's more efficient. And it's building. It's actually not sort of solving the problems in a really solid way. Another quote here was, at least with contingent, you still have a person you can develop. With outsourcing or AI, you're optimizing tasks, not building teams. And I see that sort of insertion of AI into it as this progression of like, hey, instead of having a team, let's outsource it. Instead of outsourcing it, let's just use AI. And that doesn't solve all of the problems that companies are facing.
I couldn't agree more. And some of the conversations that I heard were around the idea of, yes, outsourcing is turning into a potential solution. Thinking about AI as its own workforce is a potential solution, but it doesn't change the fact that they still need. It might be transitioning towards solving problems, but really that's what work has always been about, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Building teams that can solve problems. So now, as they're kind of thinking in this new world, as there's plenty of transition, if they don't have the ability to build a great team internally, they're still looking for organizations that are going to build those great teams to perform, because at the end of the day, they're looking for performance, they're looking for results, they're looking to solve problems in whatever shape that might might look like. That's what they're looking to. That's who they're focused on partnering with.
Well, yeah, and I think that probably it's going to be a combination of all those things. I think that was something that came out in a lot of conversations that I had at the show, and just following up from it was that, there's not one solution to a problem. And the AI might be part of that solution, and you may have to bring that talent in house, or outsourcing might be a solution for a problem. But contingent or apprenticeships might be a way of kind of developing talent based on a project that is maybe short term. So,
Mhm.
in other words, if you need a group of people that are going to be a long term possibility for your company, but you have a short term challenge, those programs might be a way of kind of doing both. And it's really kind of about, is a company in the future going to be a group of people solving problems, or is it going to be a group of people outsourcing their problems to somebody else? And I don't think we know the answer to that, but it seemed to me like this group was very concerned about it, and then and also seeing how it's not effective for everything. That outsourcing strategy.
I thought that was one of my greatest takeaways personally, was nobody is claiming to have the answer. Nobody is claiming to know this is exactly what you're supposed to do. So it becomes that much more important to be so intentional about who we're learning from, who we're partnering with, and everybody is looking for somebody who is going to help them figure it out with them. That's one of the beautiful things about where we're at in the transition of this new workforce, is we're all figuring it out together.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Katie, I think that that's a great way of summing things up, actually. I was going to ask you for the final word on things, but I think you kind of got there on your own. So, like I said, we'll make this available to download. It's a really terrific, really in-depth document, and we're going to do more with it in the future and have more of these discussions in the future. Katie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, James.
Thanks for listening to the Teams by Intent podcast, brought to you by Breault Placement. As traditional talent models struggle to keep pace with change, Breault Placement is helping leading organizations reach their goals by expanding access to overlooked talent pools and building teams that are designed to evolve. You can learn more at upro.com. That's YUPRO.com. I'm James Krause, and thanks for listening.